Well, good morning, everyone. Just want to welcome you this morning and begin by saying I really appreciate the visionary leadership and work of the organizations here this morning with Project Education Impact. And just want to start also by acknowledging that we're on Indigenous land, wherever we may be sitting in this virtual digisphere. This morning, we're here to talk about the work of our young people. And right now, as we all know, we're experiencing so many different levels of need in our communities, from digital equity issues to helping our students as they go through this remote learning process. But the work starts within ourselves. And I believe that we must meet them where they're at and help them look beyond this current circumstance to a broader purpose in order to affect real change in the world. And our young people are not just the future, but they're the present, and they are doing so much to try to get through this. And I think as adults and as systems, we can help them navigate this difficult time. And so I think that it takes critical self-reflection at every level with all of us to work with kids that are in need. There's so much trauma right now that we know, and on a personal level, on an institutional level, and the intersection of that work starts with how we come together and build coalitions to help our young people. That is the lens that we must look through right now in this moment. And that is the lens that it takes for us to transform the system that we're in and begin to repair our communities. So I really want to just thank everyone for being here this morning, gathering in this place and the space to speak with you as we launch the work of Project Education Impact and begin to do work for all of our young people, all of our families and our communities. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And hello, everyone. I'm State Representative Michelle Calder, and when I was younger, I was in foster care and then later became a foster parent, and I am currently a parent now, but I only do short-term care. And so one of the things that I've seen with this pandemic is prior to the pandemic, there was already an educational gap. I served on the educational committee for 6 years, and I think one of the most sad things that I saw was when they look at the graduation rates of all different cohorts of children. And the two lowest categories was foster youth and homeless youth. And I think one of the things that really struck me is that foster youth was even lower than homeless youth. We have to make sure that we are fixing that educational gap. Right now, there are so many children that are displaced and they're not engaged. And, together, that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about Project Education Impact, is getting people from all different walks of life coming together collaboratively to come up with solutions as to how to fix this problem. So I really appreciate you guys coming this morning. I appreciate everything that everyone's doing, and I look forward to continuing to working with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Johnson and Representative Calder. It is a real pleasure to partner with you to advance education success for our youth experiencing foster care and homelessness. My name is Dawn Rains. I am Chief Policy and Strategy Officer with Treehouse. Before we officially get started, just a word about today's format. We have a lot of information to share with you, but please, if you have questions along the way, please put them either in the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll definitely have time for questions at the end. If we run out of time, we will follow up with you directly. I know many of you have hearings that you need to get to at 8, so. We just want to start today by sharing a bit of information about Project Education Impact, affectionately known as PEI, with you. PEI is the culmination of more than a decade of cross-systems collaboration to improve the educational outcomes of youth in foster care and youth experiencing homelessness. Students experiencing foster care and students experiencing homelessness face many of the same educational conditions. They've experienced a lot of uncertainty, trauma, and instability. They've changed living situations and schools often many times. They live with the daily stress of whether they're going to see their mom this week or where they're going to sleep tonight. As a result, these highly mobile students experience similar educational outcomes and perform worse on nearly every educational outcome than every other student group in our state. They are also disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and youth of color. When our youth do not graduate from high school, they're much more likely to experience poverty, behavioral health issues, homelessness, and incarceration as adults. So in early 2017, Treehouse found itself at the end of a long and disappointing cross-systems effort to achieve a new data sharing agreement between child welfare, education, and the nonprofit partners that serve these students. And it was an effort that failed. In analyzing that failure, we realized we hadn't secured the buy-in we needed from leadership of the agencies and organizations. So we reached out again to our state agency and nonprofit colleagues and went all the way to the top, secretaries, superintendent, and CEOs, and asked them all to come to the table and advance the educational outcomes for students in foster care. To our delight, they all said yes. I do think I have to give a shout out to our timing and our partners at the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, as the new agency was in the midst of forming at this time. So we had a lot of good energy and buy-in from DCYF at the time. And so we convened our first meeting in late 2017 of what would eventually become a Project Education Impact. During the 2018 legislative session, we put forward a bill, our first ever, that we wrote together across systems, that legislatively mandated our work group and required a report to the legislature with our recommendations. A bill with the exact same language, but applying to students in homelessness, was introduced within days. And Treehouse Building Changes and other organizations had already been talking about trying to align policy and practice for our two populations wherever it made sense. So we advocated to merge these two bills together and to expand the existing work group to address the needs and outcomes of both student groups. And Project Education Impact was born. So our goal is to achieve educational parity for students experiencing foster care and or homelessness, all the way from pre-K through post-secondary education, and to close the disparities that exist between our racial groups by 2027. This is aligned with OSPI's commitment that every student subgroup graduates from high school by 2027. We produced that required report to the legislature in January of 2019 that included three major recommendations. First, make ample investments to support the educational success of our children and youth experiencing foster care and homelessness. Second, align, coordinate, and monitor policy, services, resources, and outcomes. And then finally, leverage data to inform real-time individualized education supports for students, as well as longitudinal analysis of educational outcomes. During the 2020 legislative session, we passed Senate House Bill 2711. Thank you, Representative Johnson, for your sponsorship, which sustains our work group through at least 2024, added legislators and members from the EOG OAC, and requires a biannual report to the legislature. The group appointed, the PEI group appointed Treehouse and Building Changes to co-lead PEI in partnership with OSPI to ensure that we balance our focus between the needs of the two student populations. And this year we are super excited to have, to adopt our first shared Project Education Impact legislative agenda, which we're excited to share with you today. I just want to take a moment to introduce to you our members. And maybe next slide, Eileen, thank you. So we're proud to be a work group that is comprised of 4 legislators, 6 public entities or agencies, and 7 statewide nonprofit organizations. And our panelists today include myself, Sarah Brady, Policy and Advocacy Manager from Child Care Resources, Katara Jordan, Senior Manager of Policy and Advocacy at Building Changes, and Juliette Schindler-Kelly, Director of Public Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at College Success Foundation. And though our members from our nonprofit advocacy organizations are speaking this morning, our state agency partners are on the call today and available to answer any questions that you may have. So we want to spend just a few minutes reviewing the educational outcomes of our students and why we believe that targeted wraparound supports are required if they are to achieve educational parity with their peers. As I mentioned earlier, highly mobile students perform worse than their peers on every educational measure, including kindergarten readiness, attendance, behavior, test scores, grades, graduation rates, and post-secondary enrollment and completion. An Erdc report in 2018 that was part of our report to the legislature showed us that our students start school behind their peers at the point of kindergarten readiness, and that those disparities persist or worsen over time. By the 9th grade, our highly mobile students are missing 1/3 of school days. And for the class of 2020, only 50% of youth in foster care and 59% of youth experiencing homelessness graduated high school on time. Next slide, thank you. Our students were already significantly behind before COVID-19 school building closures, and this crisis has only deepened and been exacerbated by this crisis. Now, Katara and I'd like to share a bit of what we're seeing nearly a year into the pandemic. So in mid-November, Treehouse surveyed our team about nearly 1,200 students in foster care statewide that we are serving. And what we found was very, very concerning. First of all, we're seeing very high levels of disengagement. 40% of students in foster care were only somewhat engaged in school, and 9% are completely disengaged. 44% need academic remediation, tutoring, or homework help to address failing grades and learning loss. And 36% of foster and relative caregivers need more support to meet the educational needs of the youth in their homes.
So unfortunately, there isn't a comparable program like the Treehouse Education Advocates that are working with students experiencing homelessness across the state. So we are completely reliant on OSPI and school districts, which has proven difficult in capturing data because of the pandemic. That said, we are hearing from liaisons that it is extremely difficult to track students experiencing homelessness because they have already checked out, because they aren't engaging with a mentor or someone that they can trust to discuss their current stability. And while we are hoping to get this data from OSPI soon, we just don't know how many students are not enrolled and should be.
Even with COVID-19, our youth are still highly mobile. We found in our survey that 22% of youth in foster care have changed placements since August 1st, excuse me. And 11% have experienced at least one school change since August 1st. And these are twice the rates we saw last spring when the pandemic first started.
COVID has only made student mobility worse, with many students moving so often from schools that schools can't keep track of where they are. When students were in the building, there was a physical location where staff could connect with them. But despite doing outreach, visiting campgrounds, and attempting to make contact by phone, it has been generally difficult for schools to connect with students and their families experiencing homelessness. Also, what we're hearing is that because of their high mobility, students experiencing homelessness are leaving districts and trying to enroll in other districts where they can find a place to stay, but they are finding it difficult to enroll because of their homelessness status. And, they're not always aware of how the law protects or, wanting to share with people that they are experiencing homelessness. And so in regards to basic needs, in April 2020, Building Changes did conduct a survey with 74 school districts across 32 counties who collectively serve nearly 17,000 students experiencing homelessness. And at the time, the top needs were food, internet access, devices, hygiene supplies, and rental assistance. However, many months later, we have some indication that those needs have slightly changed, and it's likely that devices and internet access would not be as high as a priority. We also know that schools are terrified for what the end of the eviction moratorium may mean for students and their families experiencing homelessness, especially if it is expected that the moratorium will end this summer when school is not in session. Schools will either see a huge influx of students experiencing homelessness in the fall or completely lose contact with students and families during the summer. This is a particular concern for unaccompanied homeless youth. We also have heard from some liaisons that most families have a hard time connecting with resources because of the delays on the community provider side caused by COVID, and students don't have access to much needed behavioral supports. This is especially true for BIPOC students and students from immigrant communities.
In terms of children and youth in foster care, what we found in our survey was that 13% of foster youth or their caregivers and families were in need of food assistance, and at least 10% needed housing or rental assistance. So what we're finding is also that special education is better in this fall and into winter, but the many needs are still not being met. So about 40% of our students at any given time qualify for special education supports. And at the moment, about 23% of eligible students are receiving inadequate accommodations, and 6% are receiving no accommodations at all. And like I said, however, this is a lot better than we saw last spring when the pandemic first began. In terms of technology needs, what we're finding is that they are mostly being met, at least the technical ones. Most students have devices and most students have access to the internet. There are some adaptive issues in terms of tech support needed, in terms of being able to interface with the various platforms that school districts are using, and that kind of thing. But in terms of the devices and the internet access, I think at least for the students that Treehouse is serving, we have largely solved that issue.
And for students experiencing homelessness, as I mentioned before, in April 2020, technology needs, when we surveyed liaisons, seemed to be more of an acute concern for students experiencing homelessness. But from what we are hearing from liaisons, it seems that technology needs are generally being met in terms of device access. Still, even with access to devices, a student experiencing homelessness may not have a wall to plug in their device, or a safe place to attend classes or speak to a liaison. We also suspect that many students haven't even turned their devices on because they've already sort of given up on school this year. Some of the other barriers that we're just experiencing or seeing on both populations is that they are struggling to receive needed language access supports for immigrant students and much needed behavioral health supports, especially for BIPOC students. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who will kick off our discussion of our shared legislative agenda.
Thank you, Katara and Don, and hi everyone. Child Care Resources, really glad to be a part of this conversation with our colleagues, to be talking about these needs as early as childcare and early learning. And important context for this part of our legislative agenda is that the age at which a person in the US is most likely to enter a shelter or transitional housing is infancy, followed by ages 1 through 5. So this is, and the earlier and longer the duration of homelessness, the greater the toll it takes on a child's health and development. And what we found at Child Care Resources, we host the statewide call center for families, the childcare, needing access to childcare. And we work closely with families experiencing homelessness to secure access to childcare. And we found a drop off of, we're currently in touch with about 46% of the numbers of families that we were experiencing homelessness that we were in touch with last year. So we're seeing that same disengagement on the childcare and early learning end. So ensuring that continuous access to quality, caring, early learning environments and childcare really is it's a critical upstream way to disrupt these cycles of homelessness and poverty. And for the 2 early learning priorities we're focused on with PI is preserving the homeless grace period for Working Connections Childcare. However, during the implementation of this legislation, the language of the policy was clarified to establish, and it was a 12-month waiting period was established for families once they'd completed a 1-year authorization and before they could access the next one. But with the difficulty of securing work in this economy and the eviction crisis looming, it's all the more necessary to make sure that children experiencing homelessness have that access to childcare. And so we're asking for this to be a consideration for federal stimulus funds that might come to cover an additional year of that grace period. And then ECAP offers comprehensive supports for families experiencing homelessness with a high percentage of students in the state-funded pre-K ECAP programs experiencing housing instability. So we're asking to maintain that funding, and the Fair Starts for Kids Act is House Bill 1213 and Senate Bill 5237, and that greatly expands eligibility to this group for families experiencing homelessness. I also want to note that many of the bills that we're sharing today, they're not an exhaustive list of all the bills that are impacting the populations that we work with or the priorities that we're pursuing, but we want to share them as a starting point. And so I want to turn it over to Katara to set the scene for the K-12 space.
Thank you, Sarah. So the data and stories from those on the ground reveal that highly mobile students are disengaging from school. PEI strongly believes now is not the time to cut existing funding for crucial education supports. And in the K-12 space, we are prioritizing funding for existing programs such as the Graduation Success Program, where Treehouse Education Specialists work one-on-one with high school students in foster care to stay on track to graduate and create their own plan for high school and beyond. The Education Advocates for Youth in Foster Care Program, a partnership between Treehouse and DCYF that works with youth in foster care, their caregivers, and caseworkers to remove barriers to school success. The Homeless Student Stability Program, a grant program administered by OSPI and Commerce that supports students experiencing homelessness and provides funding to nonprofits to support school housing partnerships. And the Supplemental Education Transition Planning Program, also known as SETUP, which assists youth in foster care and unaccompanied homeless youth in making the transition from high school to post-secondary enrollment and careers. PEI also proposed the idea behind SB 5184, which is OSPI agency request legislation, which requires each K-12 public school to establish a building point of contact in each elementary, middle school, and high school building to coordinate services and resources for students in foster care. Finally, we generally support efforts to close the digital equity gap among students. While PEI agrees that access to devices and the internet is important, access is not enough, and highly mobile students need additional education supports to effectively re-engage in school. And now I'll pass it over to Juliet, who will discuss our higher education priorities.
Thank you, Katara. Good morning, everyone, again. I'd like to touch on two higher ed priorities today that PEI has all convened to support. The first one is the Passport to Careers program. The Passport, as you may know, is a nationally recognized model that provides financial aid and wraparound services to students who experience foster care and also now unaccompanied homeless youth. However, due to legislative action to expand the program, but without accompanying funding, the program is experiencing a significant shortfall. We're thrilled the governor's budget includes the full funding to restore the student at campus funding needed, and we're asking for legislative support. There were, before the expansion, about 300 students. The expansion is now increased to 830 and is expected to continue to grow. This funding not being restored with that expansion means, in essence, there's a significant impact to students because their annual award went from 4,500 to 2,000. There's also an impact on the institutional support. Historically, Passport has provided funding to campuses to provide basic supports to Passport eligible students over the years. And to date, Passport funding has been suspended for this fiscal year. Campuses are trying to serve with emergency funding, but it's not enough. It often requires the student to take action. It's not sustainable because much of it was covered through CARES funding. At CSF, an example of the need that we've seen with students is we've stepped in and used some of our WASAC funding during the pandemic. And in just about 3 months, we dispersed over $100,000. And many of these were basic needs so students could continue their education. The timing could not be worse. These are students with the largest educational outcome gaps. It's absolutely an equity issue. The pandemic's having a disproportionate effect on these students, and we're very concerned about their persistence and increased loan borrowing, as well as just their well-being. So thank you for that consideration. I also wanted to touch on that's a funding piece, obviously. We also have a legislative piece that we're working together with supporters and members, and that's for the College Bound Scholarship Program, and it's to make College Bound Scholarship students auto-enrolled and remove disqualifying checks in the program. This would reduce barriers for students at the point of sign up and high school graduation. College Success Foundation works together with WASAC and OSPI and partners with these students and sign them up, and we've seen firsthand the obstacle that these signups can cause these students. Currently, it requires a signed application 7th and 8th grade, and in some cases 9th grade. The Governor Inslee has released a 30-day proclamation at the end of last year to allow auto enrollment, and this was a successful experiment. It's resulted in over 179,000 completed college-bound applications, and we want to build on this for future students. Also, foster students have been auto-enrolled in college-bound for several years, and this has been very beneficial. So we want the same for all students who are eligible. Currently, there's Senate Bill 5321, which addresses some of these barriers by eliminating by auto-enrolling, eliminating the 2.0 GPA high school graduation requirement, which has been an equity concern. Of course, the students still need to meet admissions requirements and standard academic progress to get state aid. It also removes a felony restriction, which aligns it with eligibility with the Washington College Grant. So we're still working with the sponsor and others to make sure barriers are fully eliminated, and we appreciate the support and happy to answer any questions during Q&A. Thank you.
Eileen, next slide, please. So a call to action regarding education investments at the state and federal level. As you've heard today, these two student populations face additional educational barriers because of factors that often exist outside of the classroom, such as navigating the child welfare system and not having a safe place to sleep at night. These challenges are only amplified by existing structural and racial inequities that make it harder for our students to access quality education and the supports needed to address them. Please remember that basic education funding does not cover the additional supports needed by highly mobile students. Without these additional supports, we are effectively depriving educational opportunities to students experiencing homelessness and those in foster care. COVID-19 has only exacerbated these barriers to academic success. In addition to supporting plans for reopening schools and recovering learning loss for all students, the legislature must consider directing specific funding for highly mobile students to support their transition back to school, access to early learning, childcare supports, and basic needs. Most importantly, we know that directing investments to our students lead to positive outcomes. Since 2014, the four-year graduation rates for students in foster care and those experiencing homelessness have both increased by 14 percentage points, which is twice the rate of increase of their peers in the general student population. That said, even though these investments are working, they are not available to a majority of highly mobile students statewide. In the midst of a pandemic, now is not the time to disinvest in programs supporting highly mobile students. To continue these gains and mitigate the impact of COVID-19, we recommend that a portion of future and current federal stimulus dollars be used to specifically address highly mobile students' needs. The legislature can accomplish this through existing mechanisms by investing significantly in the Washington State Student and Youth Homelessness COVID-19 Response Fund. This fund is a partnership between the Raikes Foundation and Building Changes that was created to augment existing public emergency dollars to support students and youth and young adults experiencing homelessness. To date, this fund has granted $3.2 million. 77% of individuals that are served by this fund are people of color. The legislature can also prioritize students experiencing homelessness and foster care and federal relief funds to both OSPI and funds going directly to school districts, because these students are the students that are furthest from economic or educational justice. Also, as you consider the 2021-23 budget, We call on you to make continued and increasing investments and reduce obstacles to post-secondary attainment in highly mobile students, including supporting the Homeless Student Stability Program, the Graduation Success Program, Passport to Careers, the College Bound Scholarship, the Working Connection, and ECAP programs to serve more highly mobile students. All of these recommendations align with the legislature's intent to prioritize equity and responses to COVID-19 this session. Because these recommendations recognize the specific needs of student populations that are furthest from education opportunity and seek to collaborate with others to address those needs with specificity. In closing, we ask the legislature to prioritize students experiencing homelessness and those in foster care and provide stronger direction for OSPI to do so as well. Now I will turn to Sarah to facilitate questions and answers.
Thank you, Katara, and thank you all for joining us today. We have all our Project Education Impact members are here and available to answer any questions you may have. If we can't answer all your questions, we'll follow up directly and in a follow-up, and we might have at least one question, time for at least one question to answer.
I'm seeing a comment from Angelique in the chat about ensuring that we successfully draw down all of the Chafee dollars that we are eligible to receive under the latest federal COVID legislation. I know DCYF is currently working on that plan and has been consulting members of PEI about how we might do that. So I know that is well underway.
Thank you, Dawn. Any final questions?
Well, seeing no questions, I guess we'll go ahead and close. Thank you so much to all of you for making the time to be with us this morning. Please do feel free to reach out to any of our organizations if you have any follow-up questions or need more information about a particular piece of legislation or investment. We really appreciate you all taking the time, and everyone have a great day.